Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I am your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again Glen Downs. He is the Chief of Staff of U.S. Congressman Walter Jones. Walter Jones has been around for some 9 terms as a Republican, and I know was a good friend of Ron Paul's. They got along very well, at least on a lot of the issues. More than most congressmen agreed with Ron, I think that's fair to say. But in any event, Glen's been working with Congressman Jones for a while now. Prior to joining his staff, Glen was a legislative assistant to U.S. Senator Senator Faircloth. I remember the name very well in the past, and where he handled banking and financial services legislation, as well as other budget and tax-related matters. Glen was formerly Chief of Staff to Lieutenant Governor of North Carolina and former Assistant Cabinet Secretary in the administration of North Carolina Governor Jim Martin. And prior to entering government and politics, he was a financial officer at BB&T, now one of the nation's largest financial holding companies, spanning most of the southeastern United States, I should say. Well, so you can see that Glen has had quite a bit of a background both in the political as well as the financial realm. So really glad to have you with us, Glen. Thanks for joining me again.
Well, thank you very much for having me back, Jay. It's a real pleasure.
It is a pleasure talking to you. You always have a lot of great insights working down there in Washington. The reason I think you have insights, even though you do work in Washington, I might say, is because you also keep, I would say, keep in touch with the world, with the real world, more than I think a lot of the people inside the Beltway do. So in any event, I'd like to start out by asking you a little bit about Congressman Jones. What committees does he sit on?
Yeah, presently, Jay, Walter Jones only serves on the House Armed Services Committee, which obviously is DOD and National Defense and related matters. He was a member of the House Financial Services Committee and served as the Vice Chairman of the Domestic Monetary Policy Subcommittee under Dr. Ron Paul. But after that, because he was insufficiently loyal to Republican leadership, he was invited off of that committee. You might remember at the beginning of this Congress, about a year and a half ago now, there was kind of a mini purge of members that the Republican leadership did not believe were sufficiently loyal to them, and they all were people who had at least some affiliation with Dr. Paul. So that is a real. There's a real sort of a civil war going on within the Republican Party.
Oh, for sure.
Not a fully broken out thing, but there's a real tension between grassroots people, Tea Party people, Ron Paul, liberty-oriented folks, and between the K Street, Wall Street wing of the Republican Party. And presently, we see that exhibited in the whole issue of illegal immigration and the case for amnesty of some sort for illegal immigrants. So you've got people on Main Street who are Republican voters who are very much opposed to that, and then down in K Street and up in Wall Street, there's a completely different view.
Yeah.
And that shows up on a host of issues, and that was part of the dynamic that led to Congressman Jones and others being stripped of a little power around here. But oddly enough, what you see is along with Congressman Jones, there's a group of people who call themselves the Republican Liberty Caucus. It's a caucus within a caucus, and that's actually on the rise. That is the energy within the Republican Party has come from the taxpayer groups and the liberty groups, but there's a real tension between the different forces within the GOP, and how that plays out is going to be something really to watch in the weeks and months ahead.
Oh, I would think so. I have to wonder. I want to ask you some things about talk some more about that division within the Republican Party. But before we go there, let me ask you the subcommittee, the House. What was it? House Commerce, the one that Ron Paul headed up. What was it called?
Domestic Monetary Policy Subcommittee.
Oh, well, I mean, I don't think there's any need for a domestic monetary policy. We have the Federal Reserve, and they are omniscient when it comes to money. So why would there need to be some little picky Republican like Ron Paul asking questions. But anyway, does that committee still exist? I can't see why it would.
Well, it does still exist, but you haven't heard much about it because it's not doing very much.
Well, what would it do? I mean, it knows that they have their god or goddess now over at the Fed. Why would they? Of course they don't do anything. Why would they do anything, right?
Well, you're really you're sarcastically raising a pretty important point, and obviously the founders of the country, first of all, vested the monetary policy was explicitly enumerated in the Constitution as being something that Congress was supposed to control, and there were very strict parameters around that. But what you've seen, not only in monetary policy, but a host of other things, Congress, which is supposed to be first amongst equal in the three branches of the government, it's the first one mentioned, Article 1 of the Constitution, is really become a distant third.
Yeah.
Ever-increasing power of the executive branch, the power of the courts, and Congress has become more and more like the Roman Senate, where it gets together and bloviates some, but in fact
has no power.
Well, it's got power, but it's going to have to assert it. It's going to have to assert it as an institution, have to assert its own powers. You can't expect the executive branch to hand power back to Congress, or the courts to hand power back to Congress. There's supposed to be a creative tension between these three branches of government,
right,
where no one has got the final say. There's a creative tension was designed into the system, but Congress has, for some reason, has moved away from being a representative form of government to being almost like a pseudo-parliamentary system, or at least a parliamentary form of government overlaid over a representative form as envisioned by the Constitution. And as such, what happens is you'll see Democrats in Congress acting as if they were taking orders from their prime minister, if the Democrat president happens to be a Democrat, and the Republicans do the same thing. Instead of saying, hey, listen, I get it, we're on the same team here, but you need to understand I am an independently elected constitutional officer in a different branch of government. And so my job, if I'm a Democrat and there's a Democratic president, is still to do oversight, legitimate oversight over the executive branch agencies, and we are going to have some policy discussions between ourselves, too. Instead, you have Harry Reid and the Democrats in the Senate, in this particular instance, running interference for Mr. Obama in this particular case. And so it's become a very diminished branch of government, the legislative branch, but the legislators have done it to themselves. And until they go and take that power back, using the power of the purse and other tools, I don't expect much in the way of change in terms of this drift towards increasing centralized power of government. It's very disturbing. That's why we see the situation on the border like we see now, where the president, part of the president's oath of office is to faithfully execute the laws of the land. He's just simply saying, I'm not going to enforce these border laws that I don't like, and Border Patrol agents have been given instructions, according to Border Patrol agents, to effectively turn a blind eye, if they come in and sort of say the magic words, they get into the country, and then they're being dispersed now throughout the country when members of Congress have shown up at these facilities where these juvenile illegal immigrants, and some of them are quite young, but others are actually very old teenagers, have to see what's going on. They've been denied entry. But until Congress does something to assert its power back and say, hey, you're going to treat us this way, no money for you, then expect Mr. Obama to continue doing what he's been doing, which is just to stiff arm, give a Heisman to Congress.
Glenn, let me ask you this. This president, I believe, is being very active on giving executive orders. Are there any limits to executive orders? I mean, unless the Congress stands up and takes and tries to impeach him. I can't remember. There's some things he's been proposing recently I thought were just absolutely dictatorial.
Well, he has done a lot of that, but this is a trend and I'm certainly not want to defend Mr. Obama, but this is the trend that really began before him.
Sure.
You might remember when President George W. Bush was in office, when he would sign bills into law, he would issue what he called a signing statement, and basically saying, and the signing statement was to say, I'm signing this bill into law, but I do not consider sections 1, 3, and 7 to be valid, and therefore I won't be enforcing them. That's a simplistic way of putting it. And Republicans were very silent. Republicans in Congress were very silent about that excess, those executive branch excesses, because it was a Republican president.
Well, that's wrong.
Mr. Obama, right. So now we have Mr. Obama doing it, and you don't have the moral authority to make a principled stand.
Exactly, because you didn't,
When you did, when it was your guy.
Exactly right.
So just like when you saw when Mr. Bush was president, Mr. George W. Bush was president, and you saw all these anti-war Democrats that were talking about constitutional this and constitutional that.
Right.
Suddenly now it's their guy.
And they don't care now.
They've gone silent. That shows you how principled their position was not. It was just simply, if it was a Republican president and we could try to hang it around his neck, we were going to do it. And conversely, to be fair, there are Republicans that are shocked, as they said in Casablanca, about these excesses from Obama, but who were, when it was President Bush, were A-OK with it, or seemingly A-OK with it, because they didn't want to go against, quote-unquote, their president.
Or at least silent about it, or they probably have been some repercussions for them politically in one way or another from the president, perhaps. So it's what bothers me, Glenn, is that it seems this growing tendency to ignore law, the rule of law and the Constitution, and make exceptions. Your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth, and to hell with you. If you don't agree with it, I'm going to do what I want to do anyway. And that just seems to be the attitude of the country, not only in Congress perhaps, but on Wall Street as well. But getting back to your boss's the committee he serves on, the House Armed Services Committee. Why in the world would they let him serve on that committee? I mean, the military industrial,
Well, he has paid a price for the positions that he's taken. By virtue of seniority, he should be a chairman of a subcommittee now. But he is not, and he is not because he's been explicitly told in a variety of different venues over time. It's because he will not support a lot of the military adventurism overseas, and so he would not support as you know, he was somebody who initially was a reluctant supporter, is a full supporter of the engagement in Afghanistan, was a reluctant supporter of the engagement in Iraq. Later, he came to regret deeply his vote on authorization to go into Iraq because he believed that the intelligence that he had seen had been, let's say, manipulated.
Yep.
It was some of it was just made up.
Sure.
By Iraqi informants and things, and others it was real intelligence, but you were only shown selective parts of real intelligence, and you didn't see the real intelligence that indicated that the case, which undermined the case for going to war. And he obviously now is very much, per se, the time to have wrapped up the adventure in Afghanistan is long, long over. And we're propping up a corrupt dictator over there now. And so that view is very much of a non-interventionist view, and that's a growing view within the Republican Party, but it is not the view of the Republican leadership here. And it's very much in step with the establishment, the foreign policy establishment here in Washington, D.C.
Which gets us back to this tension issue you were talking about within the Republican Party. So from a populist point of view, I guess that probably the people are behind the more libertarian wing of the party. Is that fair to say?
I think that is fair to say, and I think polls seem to really indicate that. And that really was the traditional Republican view. People remember Senator Bob Taft. People, not too many people, but it's been a while now.
No, not even I remember him, and he was from Ohio, and so am I.
And Taft was the conservative nominee,
right?
Or the conservative candidate against Eisenhower in 1952. Bob Taft was Mr. Conservative.
Yep.
And Mr. Conservative was very much against this internationalist, globalist wing of the foreign policy establishment, and was very much he was not he wasn't an isolationist in the sense that he thought America ought to pull up the drawbridge and stick to its own knitting, like literally within just a completely isolated country. But like Dr. Paul, is hey, we should trade with everyone, we should have engagement with everyone, people should travel and be aware of what's going on in the world, and people can cooperate and things. But these entangling alliances that George Washington warned against, and then now more than tangling alliances, these supranational governmental organizations that somehow, Americans find their troops being deployed under the auspices of NATO in some country that's not a NATO country being attacked, but it's some NATO adventure someplace else in the world, and so it's kind of moved beyond that. But that Taft wing of that's what Republican conservatives traditionally have believed. It was only during the Cold War era and then this aftermath here where there has been this big muscular intervention. The United States is the indispensable nation, and we have vital national interests we need to protect. And in their minds, those vital national interests are literally everywhere at all times, every place on the globe.
Right.
And, of course, now, after having spent a couple $1 trillion in Afghanistan and Iraq, having completely worn down a lot of the material and the people and this sorts of things, and the fact that we are broke as a nation, we are up to our eyeballs in debt and broke, even if you think you would like to, even if you are the type who would like to intervene everywhere all the time, we don't have the money to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But you do find that there are people trying to still play that Metternickian game of geopolitical chess and try to have, what's going on in the Ukraine today is not unrelated to what's going on in Syria. It's not
Sure.
unrelated to what's going on in Afghanistan. It's not unrelated to the competition for resources and dollar hegemony and all of those things. And so it's a mess. But we're still entangled in that, and how that's all going to play out is going to be something we're living it in real time right now.
Yeah, we've had a person named Stephen Harner on this show recently, and he was about 5 years in the State Department and then has spent the last 30 years in the private sector in Tokyo, and he has a company in Beijing. I think it's in one of the major Chinese cities. It's in Shanghai, actually, I believe. Anyway, he's been involved. He lives in Tokyo. And what he said, essentially, I guess, would be no surprise to you, but I hadn't really thought of it in terms of these nations under the NATO alliance, and including with Japan, they're being really client states of the United States ever since World War II, essentially, and that they don't really, they have to take their marching orders, essentially, to a great extent, and have had to ever since, I guess, the spoils of World War II. But now, Glenn, we look at the front page of today's Financial Times, talking actually Monday's Financial Times. Paris rails against the dollar's dominance. And here, the Parisians or the French, and I suspect others too, are becoming a little bit ticked off by the fact that we are trying to tie their hands with respect to their trade. And this has to do with sanctions, that we somehow have fined a big French bank there for going against the sanctions, BNP, I guess it is. And BNP doesn't like that very much. Another company that is very much involved in trade with Russia is the gigantic oil company Total. Yeah. And more and more it seems that the sanctions against Russia and so forth. How far do you think the Europeans will be willing to continue or to sacrifice for Anglo-American, let's say, empire building?
Well, I think part of it is so many things were after World War II were conceived as being under the defense piece of it was conceived as being under this U.S. nuclear umbrella. Japan, you see that with the NATO situation, and then obviously there was the Bretton Woods Agreement that put the beginnings of today's present monetary order in place, along with the dollar dominance as the world's reserve currency. And what you do see right now, what I see, and I think your listeners see as well, is you see a series almost every day. There's some new bilateral agreement between countries where country A, there might be South Korea and China, or it could be Russia and China, it could be Russia and Iran, where they will agree to do trade, bilateral trade in the currencies of those two countries, as opposed to converting into dollars to then trade it, which is one of the pegs of the dollar strength. Now, the other strength that people that want to pronounce the death of the dollar, I'm one of those guys who thinks all roads lead to inflation, but it's not a straight road. And the big problem is for people that think, hey, the dollar's dead tomorrow, is you've got the depth of it's still the dollar's reserve currency, and the markets are big enough, and the world's reserve currency, pardon me. The markets here are big enough and they're deep enough that if you are China or India or fill in the blank, and you want to have your foreign reserves in, they've got to be denominated in something. And if it's something other than dollars, and you try to go then make a move later, try to move that money later, you can crash the market because you're such a big player in it.
Yeah.
So you've got that, and then there is the thing that there's so much dollar-denominated debt in the world.
Right.
It's staggering how much the dollar-denominated debt. So people think the Fed's out there printing money. They're not really printing money, not yet anyway. What they're really printing is bank reserves, and so banks can create more dollar-denominated debt. So when everybody is building up debt, they're really short the dollar. It's a really giant one-sided trade. So the fact of the matter is, there's a lot of, when it says all these, the world's awash in dollars, the world's really awash in dollar-denominated debt.
Absolutely.
So the idea, if you start having with the forces of deleveraging that are in play today, which you have the central bankers and the governments of the world are desperately fighting against, but to come up with the money to actually pay off and service that dollar-denominated debt, it puts a call on the dollar, which
absolutely.
That's one of the things that's supporting it. Now you end up having what, in the fullness of time, what I suspect we'll have is what Ludwig von Mises called the crack-up boom, or you could get on the liberal side, where you have somebody like Hyman Minsky, who is anything but a conservative or a libertarian, but that's really their term in the Minsky economics is the Minsky moment.
Right.
And they're both the same thing in a sense, where people kind of realize, hey, this isn't going to work. Everybody, there are multiple and mutually exclusive claims against the same stuff out there, and suddenly you have sovereign debt problems, and people go, this isn't going to work. And they say, suddenly, I want whatever I've got out there denominated, anything, I want to cash it in for something real I can get my hands on,
right,
live in. And at that point, you end up having a hyperinflation,
right,
which is a crisis of confidence. And
yeah.
That is, I don't know how far down the road, but it could be, that becomes almost a psychological experiment at some level. Yeah.
Well, we certainly could see the other happen first. I believe very definitely that you were, I think, making a case for deflation, Glenn, if you might allow me, because you're making the point that we don't have. It's not as if you found a mountain of gold and you were on a gold standard and you have an asset-based money. I like to say that money is created. The raw material from which money is created in a fiat monetary system is debt. And if you look at the charts, debt is growing much more rapidly than income. And so I think my view, and tell me what you think, my view is the crack-up boom will wait until actual money is printed and put out and showered over the parking lots of Walmart because people can't pay their debts now. There's a growing insolvency, whether you're talking about individuals, private people, middle-class people. The corporations are pretty well off of the big ones. The little ones are getting squeezed, but local governments are still in big trouble. So it seems to me, Glenn, that we could see the opposite. Another 2008, 2009, it will occur differently because they're watching for it. But ultimately, how do you get to this hyperinflation or this crack-up boom when more and more people are in debt and they can't go out and spend anything? John Williams explains it by a demise of the dollar. The dollar will crash first. We lose confidence in the dollar. The people around the world do. And they start to trash their dollars. And I guess that's where you get the monetary velocity, where people actually say, I don't want to hold these dollars anymore. You certainly have a huge number of dollars, Glenn, but they're in the hands of a relatively small number of people and people that are in control of large financial institutions, right? So I find it very interesting, though, that it seems to me that what we're seeing is a growing discontent with dollar ownership, and it comes through very clear here, I think, in the Financial Times of Monday, 7th July. Paris rails against the dollar's dominance, and they're angry. It's not just about a dollar that's not worth anything, but it's also the fact that the United States is using its military power and its power as a global as a global powerhouse, as a dictator, essentially, as a to force countries and sort of do things that aren't comfortable for these sovereign nations. I mean, I'm looking also at an article yesterday, Glenn, on Monday, July 7th. Germany presses the U.S. over spying claims. I mean, there seems to be a growing discontent globally about the United States. Do you think that's a fair statement?
Well, it is, and there's always been some discontent. Let's say a love-hate relationship. I've had the chance to travel overseas quite a bit over the years and have meetings with government officials and people in opposition parties and the like. And you would see, I mean, even in the best of times, people they're sort of resentful of the U.S. in many ways, but at the same time, they would still want the U.S. to take the lead on this, that, or the other thing. But now you do see things like this, the NSA spying thing is much more prevalent. The discontent about that overseas is much more prevalent than people here in the U.S., and by that I mean even elected officials here in the U.S. understand. I mean, amongst our friends.
Yeah.
And it's really gotten to the point it's really beginning to really impact and hurt U.S. businesses because they'll have to sign. They'll be forced to or encouraged to sign these national security letters from the NSA and National Security Council, so that people are realizing that what's happening is that with all of the U.S. Chips, hardware, software, operating systems, routers, things that are U.S. based, that they have back doors built into them so that the NSA and or other alphabet soup intelligence agencies can get in and see what it is that you are doing.
Right.
And some people, there are way too many people in the U.S., in my opinion, are a little too blasé about that. But overseas, they're going crazy. So people are saying, we're going. That's why you saw Germany, for instance, in advance of this most recent situation where they found somebody within their own intelligence agency who was allegedly working for the United States. Before that, Germany announced they're going to cancel their contract have internet over there with Verizon, who's a U.S. provider, because they say, hey, Verizon gives back doors to U.S. intelligence.
Sure.
So you start going, hey, this is real. So we're starting to hear here in Congress from some of the trade associations that represent these technology companies. You don't see a whole lot of the technology companies themselves, like Verizon's not. They might be to other people, not to me, coming onto the Hill and saying, you got to believe you can't believe what these folks are making us do, and it's just killing us overseas. And so they get their trade associate because they don't want to incur the wrath of the alphabet soup agencies themselves, so they're getting their trade associations to hold briefings and the like. But we're still in the infancy of this. But there are people that just do not want to own a lot of the Microsoft products and things like that because they are convinced, correctly or incorrectly, but that they're not secure from U.S. government spying. And so you go, okay, well, we'll get some of these other products from elsewhere in the world, or open source software, and those we think is more secure.
Sure.
And it's starting to really, that's been one of the brighter spots in the U.S. economy, and that's one more self-inflicted wound that our government seems to be going through right now.
It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. A lot of these things, including the wars overseas that we're engaged in, and as we look at Iraq seemingly disintegrating now, and you know the head of Iraq over there seemingly teaming up, as I understand it, with the Sunnis, or actually not with the Sunnis, with the Shia. Is that right?
He is. Nuri al-Maliki is a Shia Muslim.
Right, and he's
So he very much, apparently, by all accounts, he's been kind of a hack, and a lot of the people. But don't forget, it's a hack we helped put in.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
But so they had kind of a standoff with the Sunnis over time. They've got they're religiously ideologically, we're more aligned with Iran than with the Sunni Arabs, and of course they have been more aligned with the Alawite Muslims, which are the people that run Syria as well. So that's part of what you see going on over here. It's also the Sunni Muslims want to have a pipeline going up through Syria to feed Middle Eastern natural gas into the European natural gas pipeline system as a way of teaming with Europe and the United States to undermine Russia's something close to hegemony dealing with natural gas going into Europe. Russia, of course, doesn't want any part of that, and that's part of why you see Russia being involved down there. And there's just layer after layer of intrigue, and different, religious factionalism. It's resource wars. It's about debt. It's about dollar, having dollar still be the preeminent currency in the world. It's a lot of different things all at once. But it's rare. None of those things are rarely ever used as the selling point for whatever is encouraged in the way of military adventurism or interference. That's what went on, of course, in the Ukraine. We saw the Russian being a little demonized on TV here. And
big time.
Vladimir Putin is no day at the beach. Let's be honest about that. But what they don't typically report on is that the United States, for example, spent about $5 billion in the Ukraine trying to help overthrow the democratically elected president of the Ukraine. Now, he, by all accounts, was corrupt and a hack, and he himself was ethnically Russian, and so the ethnic Ukrainians had legitimate beefs against him. But it had been UN observers had been there for his election. He was as fairly elected as Barack Obama was.
Right.
But we saw, Victoria Nuland, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the United States Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, say at the National Press Club. You can go on YouTube and see it. This is not deep, dark conspiracy stuff about how the United States has spent $5 billion to promote, I think she had a euphemism like democratic organizations.
Right. NGOs in many cases. NGOs,
And then there was the famous tape, too, where, and this, again, is on YouTube, it's just widely available, where she was discussing who it was they wanted to we were going to help put in to be the caretaker prime minister of the Ukraine after we helped topple the democratically elected president. And the United States, she's talking to the U.S. ambassador to the Ukraine, who said in that tape, well, the Europeans won't like that choice. And that's when she famously said, use the F word, F the EU.
Right.
And so that's all anybody kind of picked up.
Well, you know, Glenn, when you hear all that stuff and you can understand why other people are seeing us as the ugly Americans these days instead of, I mean, it's an empire, and we're an empire. We're not a republic anymore. But what I can't understand, it just seems to me that none of this makes any sense in terms of the interest of the voting public in America. I'm sure there's some people that are getting rich. I mean, I suppose you can buy defense stocks. It's a one-way street almost, defense stocks, because until the system breaks down, is there any doubt? Because does Congress ever say no to a defense bill? Even Democrats?
Well, it's not too often. But no. I'll tell you, the end game on this thing is how can this thing not go on forever and ever and ever? It's because we're broke. And,
right.
And so you started seeing right now, you're seeing weapon systems because of cost overruns in some weapon systems, because of other increases in spending that are sort of baked in the cake in the defense budget because of things like military health care, raises that come just as a matter of course, those kinds of things. Some of these weapon systems are really being squeezed.
Okay, Glenn, but we're just about out of time here, but we are broke, that's for sure. Yes. But how does that matter if you can keep printing money? I guess what has to happen is we have to have a breakdown in confidence of the dollar when people finally catch on that this is a worthless unit of currency and people dump it. Is that what's going to force the issue? Yes. Interest rates start to rise because people trash their treasuries, but the U.S. government can buy more of them. The central bank can buy more of them. Or more.
That's the $64,000 question, and a lot of people do puzzle out different scenarios. But you can see, for example, the Fed, because of all the shenanigans they've been in with Operation Twist and buying these mortgage-backed securities and exchanging short-term securities in their portfolio for longer-term securities, in a situation where interest rates begin to rise just a very little bit, the Fed's own bond portfolio is going to go underwater. Mm-hmm. Now, they're not forced to mark their securities to market, but they're not going to be able to then go out and sell them and do in normal monetary policy because they'd have to then go recapitalize the Federal Reserve banks.
Right, right.
So that's one of the ways that people can begin seeing scenarios where you go, hey, when things start getting a little more normalized and the Fed either loses control or loses the illusion of control over some of these things,
right?
You start seeing kind of a great unraveling begin. But what that looks like is amongst some. Most people don't want to think about that at all. But of those who do think about it, there's a great debate about what that unraveling might look like.
Well, that's we'll have to leave it go at that because we have talked about the unraveling or the reset, as Jim Rickards has talked about on this show, and I know that he is an advisor to the Defense Department, and he's talking about it, even if most people don't want to think about it inside or outside of the government. I think we have to be aware that we're in big trouble, Glenn, and I thank you very much. Not that I want to hear the bad news. We hear it week in and week out here. Now and then I get an optimist on now and then just to keep me from jumping over the cliff, I suppose. But I want to thank you again for spending time with us and for doing the good work with the good Congressman Jones. Just one last question before we let you go, though. Do you think is there anybody among the presidential candidates? Is Rand Paul? Would he be more on the side of the libertarian group? This divide that you're talking about within the Republican Party?
I think so, yeah. I think that he would be an example of the type of person who would question some of the fundamental status quo, just keep doing what we've been doing and doubling down on current failed paradigms. And so he's somebody I personally would look very favorably for.
Yeah.
But we're going to have to see how this all plays out here.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for that, Glenn, for your time again, and we'll look forward to talking to you again sometime in the near future.
Thank you, Jay. Thank
all right.
you very much.
All the best. Take care.